Hello everyone, welcome back to class, Cine 104, class number 4, and I'm your professor Dave Eccles, and today we're going to dive into foreign films. And so let's get going. There's some really fantastic stuff to see. So we're going to start off with one of the grand masters of the cinema, Akira Kurosawa, Japanese director, definitely an auteur. We've talked about auteurs and how important they are to our class. Just about every director we do is an auteur. It's their own personal vision, a personal statement, if you will. These are not, for the most part, studio films. These are auteur films. And Kurosawa, like a number of our other directors that we're going to talk about Tim Burton pairing up with Johnny Depp, and we're going to talk about Martin Scorsese pairing up so often with Robert De Niro, and later on Leonardo DiCaprio. But here we have a pretty good pairing. Akira Kurosawa worked quite frequently with Toshiro Mifune. There he is below, from Rashomon. And this is really an amazing film. Japan was just barely recovering from the devastation we wreaked upon them for World War II, and bombed out buildings and all that. And the idea that Japan could come out with such an amazing movie. This film played at film festivals around the world, in Venice and France and Germany, and people were just amazed. People were just amazed that as fine a film as this could come out right after the war. Today it would be like an amazing film coming out of Ethiopia or Somalia. It's not impossible. It just would be very surprising. We wouldn't expect something like that. Or Syria, right? A country that's been at war for so long. So Rashomon has multiple, plausible, conflicting viewpoints. And that term is really part of the language. In Japanese, it means in the forest or in the glen or something like that. But the movie is so famous that the word has taken on kind of new meaning, and people talk about a Rashomon type situation. And it's really the sort of thing that you get in court. People are telling different versions of the same story. Was she using force? Was he using force? Was somebody lying? Were they not lying? Where is the truth? Where does the truth lie? And in this film, there is a trial, and there are 4 different versions of the same crime, which is possible rape and murder. And so we don't know if it was indeed murder or self-defense. We don't know if it was indeed rape or seduction, and it's hard to tell from the 4 different viewpoints, because they're all telling versions of the story that sort of highlight them as the main character. And so we have the Toshiro Mifune character. He is a bandit or a brigand. I love that word, brigand. He runs into the young man, this young samurai, and his bride, and there is conflict, and the man is killed. The bandit is caught and brought to justice, and so at the court, they're going to tell their versions of the story. And of course, the bandit says that it was a fight, that he was such a skilled fighter, and he bested the samurai by his skill and seduced the woman, and she wanted him. And of course, the dead man's story, told through a spirit medium, says that the wife was not particularly faithful to him, and a bit of a nag, and she wasn't worthy of his great love, and the bandit cheated in the fight, and so on and so forth. Right? You can tell that he's the sort of the star of his own version. Her version, of course, is that the husband was a weakling and the bandit was smelly and awful, and neither one were worthy of her beauty and charms and so on, right? So where's the truth? And luckily for us, there is a woodcutter who quite possibly has seen the whole thing, but kind of from a distance. We're not sure if he's seen everything quite right or not, and maybe he's even making himself as a bit of the star. But we do find that it is kind of a mix of everything, right? The bandit, the brigand does kill the man. It's hard to tell if it's really a seduction or not with the woman. And the truth is really kind of fuzzy. It's really hard to tell where the truth is. And so this is such an amazing movie. It won a number of prizes and things and really put Akira Kurosawa on the map. And it was just getting us all set for his very next film. And that is The Seven Samurai, again with Toshiro Mifune. And this is a very highly influential plot. Borrowed by The Magnificent Seven, which turned it into a Western, The Three Amigos, which is a fantastic comedy. I just love it. And A Bug's Life and Battle Beyond the Stars and The 13th Warrior. And so what is going to happen is that a village in medieval Japan is attacked year after year by bandits. And they come in and they take the food and they take the grain and they take the sake and they take the women or rape the women or do awful things. And they are tired of it, so they send one of the villagers, I don't know if he's the mayor or whatever, but one of the villagers, actually a couple of them go into the local city there looking for some ronin, which are samurai that are not attached to a castle and a shogun and so on. They're sort of at loose, sort of like guns for hire. And you can see how this really translates into a Western quite nicely. And they don't have enough money, and so they can only pay them in food, and so they kind of have to find the lowest and the hungriest of the samurai. It influences any film gathering a team of experts. Okay, whether it's today with superhero movies, Avengers, Justice League, things like that. The Dirty Dozen, which is a World War II movie, Mission Impossible movies, A-Team movies like that. And there was a Western done within just a couple of years called The Magnificent Seven. So it translates quite nicely and quite easily into a Western. And there is a pretty good link to an analysis of the film, and I think the guy does a pretty good job. So I'm going to let him talk about the film. It's not long, 6 or 7 minutes, something like that. We would spend a bit of time in class watching various scenes from the film, and I just couldn't line them all up. But he does such a nice job. I'm going to let him explain the film and some of the symbolism and all that. He does a pretty good job and covers a lot of the stuff that I would have covered in class. So there's Kurosawa. He's highly revered, he passed away a few years ago, but highly revered by the great filmmakers. Francis Coppola there, George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, all sorts of people have, he was a huge influence. When these guys were in film school in the 60s, they would have studied Kurosawa, right? They would have seen Kurosawa films when they were in film school. And so here's a nice list of Kurosawa films. Don't worry about naming them all off for the test or anything like that. But we can see that a number of them were redone as Westerns. So Seven Samurai was redone as a Western. And Rashomon was actually redone as a Western too. And then we see that Kurosawa is taking a couple of Shakespeare plays and turning them into Japanese samurai type movies, King Lear and Macbeth. So he's doing that. So the cultural sharing and references sort of go back and forth from Japan to to Hollywood, or Europe anyway, and the West, and then back from Shakespeare to Kurosawa and Japan and so on. And he was making movies into the 1980s. So some really good movies here. Ran and Kagemusha were made in the 1980s. They're big, they're beautiful color movies, medieval Japan, samurai, kings, warriors, all that. They're really fantastic movies, but Seven Samurai really stands alone. It's really kind of at the top. And when anybody makes a list of the best films of all time, up there, right up there with Citizen Kane, is going to be Seven Samurai and 2001: A Space Odyssey and The Graduate, Sunset Boulevard, and wonderful movies like that. Also, on that list, Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, and a really iconic scene. You've probably seen a version of this scene somewhere, maybe in Family Guy or The Simpsons. Who knows? But it's a very famous scene, and we have Ingmar Bergman, who died recently, as a medieval knight. And he was off to the Crusades in the Middle East, and he's coming back home amidst the plague, and with his squire, and he's traveling across Northern Europe on his way back home to Sweden. So he's kind of royalty of some sort, being a knight, and he's going to run into an acting troupe and some wonderful other people that he's going to meet. And death meets him, and there's a great scene. You'll see it. Just click on that link. It's a wonderful scene. And death comes to take him, or the Grim Reaper, however you want to refer to him, comes to take him, and he says, I've been following you for a long time. Okay, so since the Crusades and the Black Death creeping over Europe. And so the knight challenges him to a chess match and says, as long as we play chess, then you won't kill me, and if I win, then you'll have to let me go. And Death, I guess being human, sort of, agrees to the challenge. He's pretty sure he's going to win. Death always wins. But we interspersed through the movie, no one else, of course, can see the figure of Death other than the knight. But every once in a while in the movie, he will go off. Death will say, I've been waiting for you, and set up the board, and then they'll have a little bit more to play, interspersed with other scenes from the movie. Some fun and comedy, and others villagers that are afraid of the Black Death, and outsiders wandering across their village and so on. So a really wonderful film, and really iconic. You recognize that scene even if you haven't seen the movie. I bet you recognize this shot right here. Next up is Federico Fellini, Italian director, definitely an auteur. Boy, when you've seen a Fellini movie, you know it's Fellini, that's for sure. He has 2 foreign language Oscars, good for him. The Dolce Vita from 1960 is one of them, and that's the Swedish actress Anita Ekberg, and she's in the Trevi Fountain, and it's La Dolce Vita translates to The Sweet Life. If you speak Spanish, you probably could have figured that out, but this is Italian. And it's a series of vignettes. There's a journalist, and he's just documenting the new Rome. Rome by 1960, 15 years after the end of World War II. It's becoming quite prosperous, and he is just meeting people as a journalist, and one of them is an American movie star, and he follows her around, this beautiful American movie star, and a few other people. So Fellini was quite famous. He'd done some more realistic type films in the 1950s, sort of neo-realism, new realism, and now he's going off and becoming a little more out there, a little more expressionistic, and that is going to culminate with his masterpiece, 8 1/2, from 1963. So this is a film about making a film, and the film that they're making in the film is 8.5. Okay, so it's very meta. Okay, it's very about itself. And here we get another director, star pairing up, Fellini and Marcello Mastroianni. Okay, Marcello, that's how you would say that. And he is kind of playing Fellini. Okay, he dresses a little bit like Fellini, but he resembles Fellini as much as I resemble Johnny Depp, okay, or Chris Hemsworth, which is to say, maybe not a lot, okay. So Fellini's a little bit idealized. Fellini was a little paunchy and a little bit balding. I'm not paunchy and balding, but I certainly don't resemble Chris Hemsworth or Johnny Depp or one of those guys. Anyway, it's a little bit of a joke there with this guy playing Guido, the director, and he's trying to figure out what his next movie is going to be. And so this is a movie about a director trying to figure out what his next movie is going to be, and basically we're watching the movie that he makes. Okay, so he's going to make this movie. Now, 8.5, a strange title, but Fellini had made a number of feature films and a few shorter films, like 30-minute type films. So by counting up how many films he had made 7 features and a short, and this was his 8.5 film. This is how many films he's made. He's made 8.5 movies. And so all through the movie, we see Guido, and sometimes he flashes back to his childhood, which of course is Fellini's childhood. His obsession with sex. He's got a wife, he's got a mistress, and later in the movie, we're going to see him casting the movie that we've been watching. We're going to see him casting for the woman to play his wife, for the woman to play the prostitute, for the woman to play the mistress toward the end of the movie in a casting session. So yeah, it's pretty out there. Fellini, his name has kind of entered the language, Fellini-esque. Fellini-esque. It has really entered the language. Strange and bizarre. Do I even have Fellini-esque? It seems, I believe you should write this down, Fellini-esque. Let's see if it's... there we go. Fellini-esque. Strange, bizarre, circus-like, dreamlike. So his name has kind of entered the language. A little bit like Hitchcockian. Alfred Hitchcock, Hitchcockian. For suspenseful and so on. So Fellini-esque, like Rashomon, has entered the language. And strange, bizarre, circus-like, dreamlike. This is the film he made after 8.5, Juliet of the Spirits. And in this one, it's kind of taking the wife's point of view. She's the wife of, not of a movie director, but she's the wife of a husband who is sneaking around, has a girlfriend, and this is kind of her side of the story. And the woman that plays Juliet is Fellini's actual wife, Julieta Messina. Okay, anyway, a lot of meta stuff there. This is Fellini's first film in color. It's really amazing. Boy, when Fellini moves to color, it's really something. The green and the stuff and the circus-like and the music, the wonderful music by Nino Rota. Oh, it's fantastic music. And he made Satyricon, which takes place in ancient Rome. He made Roma, which takes place in modern Rome and when Fellini was growing up around World War II, things like that. Another film called Amarcord, which is Italian for I Remember. And again, it is about his childhood in northern Italy and growing up and so on. So I've got a lot of pretty good clips for you to see. Just follow the links, follow the URLs, and watch some good scenes. And I hope you enjoy Fellini. Fellini's one of my favorites. We were big fans of Fellini when I was in college, way back in the day. And as always, if you see something that's kind of interesting, click on another link, right? You don't have to just click on the links that I'm providing for you. Click on another link and check it out. And follow it down the rabbit hole. See where it leads. There's some fun stuff out there. So in the business side of things, in the 50s and early 60s, roadshow becomes more and more popular. This is part of the Hollywood studios' attempt to compete with television. So they start making bigger movies, a lot of widescreen movies. We've talked about widescreen, so a lot more widescreen movies, intermissions, so longer movies, intermissions, things like that, reserve seating, which is kind of cool. I like the reserve seating we get today at a theater near me in Long Beach. It's got the reclining seats. There aren't nearly as many, probably about half as many as there used to be, but they recline, and so they are reserved. And I kind of like that, but I miss intermissions, I have to say. When I see a 3-hour movie, whether it's a Lord of the Rings or Hobbit movie, or other big movies like The Godfather and movies like that, I think, wow, 3 hours, that's kind of pushing the limit. I would say even 2 hours and maybe 40 or 45 minutes. Martin Scorsese's Wolf of Wall Street was 3 hours. There are a number of 3-hour movies out there. Avengers Endgame was 3 hours. And boy, I really, I'm editorializing here, but I sure could use an intermission. I think they could sell more popcorn and more concessions and candy bars and all that kind of stuff. The stated reason why they don't do intermissions is they're trying to squeeze more showings in per day, or per day, per evening. But most of the movie theaters that I go to have 10 or 15 or 20 screens. And the big movie, the Avengers movie or the Star Wars movies playing in a whole bunch of theaters. So I don't know that a 15-minute intermission would really allow for more showings per night. And so anybody wants to join the Bring Back Intermissions Club, I think maybe in part that's why a lot of us, me included, like streaming, because we can start and stop the movie whenever we want. I love big screens. I love big giant screens with 30 speakers surrounding me and 40-foot screen and immersed in the dark. But I also like being able to hit pause and get up and stretch my legs and go to the bathroom and fix a snack. So anyway, that's a roadshow. They are popular in the 1950s and 1960s. Also, they are limited releases. Roadshow movies are often limited release. Roadshow takes its name from theater, and after a show plays on Broadway, then they would go on the road. They played on Broadway for a year or so, and then the actors will go on the road and take the show to Chicago or LA or Philadelphia or somewhere like that. And so the movie industry borrowed that term, roadshow, and it really means big special engagement, reserve seating, all that. Sometimes in the old days, ushers would even dress up in costumes and things. A limited release, we have those today. We don't have much in the way of road shows today, but we do have limited release where films play first in big cities and then mid-sized towns and finally small towns. And movies like Parasite, which won the Best Picture Oscar this year, these smaller films, not the big Star Wars, James Bond, Fast and Furious type movies, but the little small arty Oscar type movies that are going up against the big movies right around Christmas time, going up against the big Star Wars or James Bond movies or whatever, will do a limited release. And the idea is that they will get notice from critics and from awards groups, Screen Actors Guild and Golden Globes and Oscars and all that kind of stuff, and build word of mouth. And then they can expand and play in more and more theaters. So that's limited release. They are still around. Roadshow, sadly, has left. The last roadshow I saw, Apocalypse Now, was a roadshow movie, and that was a while ago. That was way back in the late 70s, but that was kind of a roadshow movie. But I can't remember any roadshow movies with all that special engagement and reserve seating since then, so too bad. Anyway, some business terms. And I mention those business terms because that leads us into David Lean, who is a British director, and he's the master of the historical epic. Lawrence of Arabia, 1962, with international financing. Okay, so we're starting to get international financing, and we're going to talk about this again in a little bit when we get up to the James Bond franchise. Again, international financing, maybe money comes from Germany, from France, from the US, from Britain, and these kinds of movies are going to play kind of to a world audience, right? There are international stars in Lawrence of Arabia. The co-star, Omar Sharif, is Egyptian, and and Peter O'Toole is Irish, playing Lawrence of Arabia. So big movies. This one definitely had an intermission and reserved seating and all that. And they re-released it in, I think, in the 90s. And I saw it at Big Newport, a really wonderful theater down in Newport Beach, if you know Big Newport Theater. And yeah, it was very cool. Intermission, all that good kind of stuff. And so that's David Lean. It took him years, a year or two, to shoot the film, and we see these 6 people on camels in front of the camera, but behind the camera there's dozens and dozens and dozens of people. It really takes a lot of people. They're not doing blue screen, green screen stuff here. They had to go to maybe Tunisia or Jordan or somewhere where you get that classic sandy desert. It's kind of the desert that George Lucas seeks out for the Star Wars movies. And there are some great sandy deserts, iconic sandy deserts that are out there that a lot of people like. I think Tunisia and Jordan are known for having some nice desert area. Tunisia's in northern Africa, and Jordan's in the Middle East. And this is a really interesting movie. It's set around World War I, which is 1914 to 1918, and there really was a T.E. Lawrence. He was a British map maker at the time, and was and a scholar of antiquities and languages and all that. Really an amazing guy. He spoke all these languages, including Arabic and so on, and he was sent to see what the Bedouins were up to, right? The nomads. They didn't really have cities and settlements. They traveled around with their camels and their tents and so on, and he was to try to help put them together into some kind of an army, an armed force, to help thwart the Turks. And the Turks were part of the Ottoman Empire, and after World War I, they lost, and the Ottoman Empire was divided up. And so a lot of what's going on in the Middle East today, still conflict and so on, it really dates back to this period when the British and the French came in. The winners take their spoils, right, and they redraw the maps. So the maps get all redrawn after the losers lose. And also another empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria and Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that got divided up too, because they lost. And then we get countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland and countries like that. So the world really changed around 1919, 1920, when they agreed on all this. I think it's called the Balfour Agreement. But if you're interested in the Middle East or world history or any of that kind of stuff, this movie is really good. It doesn't explain everything, but it does help us understand a little bit. It's well researched and a really fine movie. And it is set in Saudi Arabia, with the royal family, the Saud, I believe it is family. I could be off on that. And we see the conflict. Lawrence is maybe offering stuff that he can't deliver once the war is over. He's offering them self-rule And of course, the British aren't really big fans of freeing up their colonies and self-rule and all the whole rest of it. So it's not really the U.S. A big reason why the Middle East has so much conflict even to this day, and the creation of Palestine and Syria, and you can look on a map and you see how straight those lines are, how straight those borders are between Syria and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and so on. And that's the British, right? That's the British out there with their surveying equipment and drawing these perfectly straight lines. Forget, religions and ethnicities and all of that. Just draw those lines about where you think they should go. And so Lawrence is there, and the Bedouins are going to start blowing up train tracks that the Turks are using, the Ottoman Turks are using, and so on. And he turned out to be quite a brilliant military tactician. He attacked a port city, and at the port city, Aqaba, all the guns were pointed out to sea, because that's where the British would very likely attack. The British had the best navy in the world. And they really couldn't even turn around. And Lawrence travels with his Bedouin army all the way across the desert, whatever, 110, 120 degree desert, on their camels, a surprise rear attack, an amazing surprise rear attack, and takes it not exactly without firing a shot, but pretty much by surprise. So he's a pretty famous person in British history, that's for sure, T.E. Lawrence. A really amazing guy. So a couple of more of the David Lean films. Bridge on the River Kwai, which is set in Thailand. I've been to the Bridge on the River Kwai. My wife is Thai, and we've been there, and it's not quite as spectacular as the movie, but that is set during World War II, and the Nazis are forcing the British to build a bridge over the river. Amazing movie, Best Picture winner, Best Director winner, and so on. David Lean won Best Picture and Best Director also for Lawrence of Arabia, so he had this amazing streak. Master of the historical epic. And then Dr. Zhivago, set during World War I and the Russian Revolution. Boy, does this guy take on big topics, okay? If you're going to do a movie, right, you can set your movie in normal whatever high school, or you can set your movie with world events and world wars, and that's really taking on big topics. And big directors, Francis Coppola, Stanley Kubrick, David Lean, they're not afraid to take on a big topic. Okay, Christopher Nolan, right? They're not afraid to take on a big topic like war. Okay, these are big directors and they have big ambitions. And so anyway, we get another one from David Lean, and this wonderful set. It's so gorgeous during the Russian Revolution. There's a doctor. He's really apolitical. He's not really part of the revolution, but he's a fairly sympathetic, well-to-do person. He's a doctor. He's not a peasant or anything like that. He's a well-to-do doctor. But being a doctor, he is healing people as best he can. And he has a wife and a mistress, Laura, and he loves them both. He truly, truly loves them both. And it's set during the Russian Revolution. Really an amazing, amazing movie, too. I love that movie. So staying in Britain, but really changing quite a bit from big, big, giant budget David Lean stuff. We're going to go much smaller with Richard Lester's A Hard Day's Night with the Beatles, if you recognize them there, the Beatles. And if you're of my generation or a big music fan, then you would know them by name. I'm not going to task you with, well, maybe I am. Let me see here. Do we have their names? There we go. Yeah, sure. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Okay, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you their names on the test or anything like that, but if you're of a certain age, like me, you would know there's Paul, there's George, there's John, there's Ringo, there's John, and the Beatles. And you might wonder, is Professor Eccles putting up just his favorite movies? in class. And yeah, partly, sure, but this is an important movie, and it did catch a lot of people by surprise. It looked like it was just a get-rich-quick movie from the Beatles, cash in on their newfound fame. They had just come to America that winter in February. They had appeared on national TV on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was sort of a televised vaudeville type show with comedians and singers and opera singers and puppets and jugglers and all that. A really crazy show. And then the Beatles would be on, and they were a big hit. And so Ed Sullivan would have on the Rolling Stones and the Doors and the Dave Clark Five and all sorts of the British groups. And you know, you're watching for the Beatles, and then they've got like some guy juggling, and then they've got puppet. Like, whoa, bring on the Beatles! Come on, bring on the Beatles! And so they, of course, Ed Sullivan, he would put the Beatles on at the beginning of the show or toward the beginning, and then he'd make you wait almost to the end of the show through the jugglers and the comedians and the opera singers and everybody else to bring back the Beatles. Anyway, so the Beatles were on in February of 1964. And so most everybody, including the Beatles, thought that they would be a flash in the pan. They certainly didn't think that they were going to be anything like Elvis Presley or Frank Sinatra, somebody that would have a 20-year career or a 10-year career. Elvis had only sort of come out in 56, so he wasn't even around for 10 years at this point. But they certainly didn't think they were anything like Elvis or anybody big like that. So they wanted to, their management wanted to do a quickie movie, and it's about them. They play themselves. They play John, Paul, George, and Ringo. They play the Beatles, and they are being chased by their fans, which actually happened. They could hardly be seen in public without screaming fans, young girls in particular, screaming and chasing after them and crying and all that sort of thing. So they dramatized it and put it in the movie. And they are rehearsing for a television program. That's it. They get on a train and they go somewhere. I don't know exactly where. And maybe they're not in London. I don't know where the TV station is. But they get on a train and they go somewhere, and then they are going to be on a show. But they are so charming, and they're so funny, and they're so natural. That it really surprised a lot of people. And Richard Lester is doing a really amazing job of directing the film. He's a pretty good director. He ended up having a pretty fair career. He did one of the Superman movies. He did The Three and Four Musketeers and a lot of pretty good movies. But this is the one that really kind of put him on the map. And the Beatles, they shot it in the spring, and it was in theaters by the fall. They were really thinking, we better get this out before they lose out. And as the picture, it is in black and white. And I mentioned earlier in the class that sound took maybe 3 years to really be about 100% of the movies. American movies were maybe 3 years, 1927 to 1930 to be sound. But color, or black and white, took about 35 years. So from 1932 or 33 or so, all the way up to 1968, it really took a while for nearly all movies, this is an American movie, but for nearly all movies to be in color. Their next movie was in color, Help, but this one was in black and white. It was cheaper. Color film cost more money than black and white film did, and this film very specifically looks a little bit like a documentary. So it looks like a documentary. It is fully scripted, but whoever wrote the documentary, or whoever wrote the movie, got to know the Beatles enough that John's sort of wry, sarcastic way, and Paul's sort of sweet peacemaker sort, and George sort of a little shy, and Ringo kind of funny, and it really did capture them. If you ever see them being themselves, like on a talk show or something like that, they're kind of like that. They're like they are in the movie. And it's easy to think that it's a documentary, but it's not. It's not a documentary at all. It's a scripted movie. but it's shot like a documentary, handheld, and all that. And it also had a big influence on music videos. There are a couple. One of the scenes that I have, "Can't Buy Me Love," that you're going to watch, is really a precursor to music videos, and the opening scenes are also like a music video in that they aren't playing their instruments. All right, a lot of music videos, they're not performance videos, right? They're not live performances. They're little stories and things. People driving around in cars or riding horses or going to the beach or whatever, right? A lot of music videos, and some of them get really nice and arty and all that. Michael Jackson, thrillers, some of that kind of stuff. Peter Gabriel's stuff was really amazing. Anyway, here we see the Beatles, but they're not playing their instruments. We hear them singing, and they're doing other stuff. And later on, the Beatles made little short color films for Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever and that sort of thing. Little 3-minute things of them doing weird psychedelic stuff, running the film backwards and doing all sorts of strange stuff that they could play. Now, this is before MTV. MTV didn't come out until 1980, but in the late 60s, they could play them on various television shows and television programs as promotionals and things like that. So you might check that out if you're kind of a fan of the Beatles or anything like that. You might check out, while you're on YouTube, check out Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields and some of that. So Hard Day's Night, maybe an interesting pick, sure. And Richard Lester, the Beatles, fully scripted and music videos. And I'm trying to help you out here with the italics. Okay, so that's kind of what it is. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to name off the Beatles or anything like that. But I do want to kind of help you out a little bit. Staying in Britain, we have the James Bond films and more international filmmaking, just like Lawrence of Arabia. International stars, exotic locations, all the James Bond movies, Jamaica, Switzerland, America, Miami, whatever, around the world. International stars, Sean Connery, who's Scottish. This is the third film, Goldfinger. Clearly, this is going to be Goldfinger. Gert Frobe, who's German, and I can't remember the name of the guy, but he's going to play Oddjob, and he's Korean. Bert Kwan, something like that. Bert Kwan, I think, is the guy that plays Oddjob. And this is a franchise film. Okay, so very clearly it generates sequels. So this is the third Bond film. The first one, Dr. No, and then bigger budget still with From Russia with Love. And now we have Goldfinger, each one bigger and bigger, bigger budgets, bigger stunts and all that. And then the fourth one, Thunderball, really big, lots of exotic locations off in the Caribbean and so on, and really cool scuba scenes and all that. So the Bond films, they really showed how to make a franchise movie and international money from Germany, France, whatever, Britain, U.S., we put a lot of the money in. The United States put a lot of the money in, but so did Britain, and I think there's some money from some other countries too. Maybe Germany. I'm not sure, but it really showed the way. Today, of course, international filmmaking is really the thing. The U.S. market today. I'm jumping way ahead. Don't worry, you can write it down later. But I'm jumping way ahead. Of the total box office for most films like Avengers type movies today, only 30% of the box office comes from the US or North America, which includes Canada. And 70% comes from foreign markets, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and all that. Okay, so that's jumping way ahead, but international filmmaking, this is kind of the way of the future right here in 1964. This is really pointing toward the future. So I've got some nice scenes for you from Goldfinger. Watch them. They're a lot of fun. The opening title sequence from Shirley Bassey, right? The title sequence, that's a big thing that you're going to get in all of the Bond films. This is like a recipe, right? Don't screw up the ingredients, and it'll bake just fine. We get the theme song from Shirley Bassey. We get a title sequence with a theme song and an action sequence at the very beginning. The beginning of this film, it is set kind of in Cuba. Okay, so 1964, Cold War, and Fidel Castro in Cuba and all that, and that had just happened just a couple years earlier. And so I mentioned that because who are the villains? And in the early going, the books were written, of course, in the 1950s, I should say, of course, but the books were written by Ian Fleming in the 1950s. And so at the peak of the Cold War, the bad guys often would be like Russians or Chinese, right? Communists. But over the years, we have more or less made up with Russia, and China is a huge audience. They're still communists, but we're not really warring at them or anything like that. We're fairly peaceful. We do so much trade with China, so much, and they're a huge part. They're the biggest film-going audience outside the U.S. So our movies have to play in China today, or the big ones anyway do. The big ones do. Well, Star Wars, Avengers, James Bond, all those movies really have to play in China. So they're not going to make the Chinese villains anymore, right? They would be upset. They don't like that. They don't want to be the villains. In this movie, a peripheral character we see is dressed in a sort of a Mao military sort of an outfit. And you can see him in the laser sequence. And there are some other Bond films where it would be vaguely Russian or Chinese or something like that. Then over the years, we start having maybe drug lords, maybe people from the Middle East, and so on. Maybe they've done Japan, they've done North Korea, and then they have been doing like big business. So not really from any particular country, but big business, and maybe domestic spying. I can't remember which one, but some of them were sort of like on domestic spying and things like that. So the villains have changed quite a bit over the years, and I think it would be kind of a fun, if you have to do a term paper or something in a class, you might trace the villains in James Bond type movies, whether it's a Middle Eastern terrorist or a Mexican drug lord or something like that, and then they move on and they move on. So all these wonderful tropes, theme song, Q, the quartermaster, and I think I have a scene for you to see from that, and he's going to show Bond the classic the classic car. Gee, I'm drawing a blank on the car here. Aston Martin, and they sort of brought it back for, I think, Spectre, something like that. They brought it back for one of his more recent movies. But here he's going to explain the car with the ejector seat and all that. It's wonderful stuff. Q. Q stands for quartermaster, so he's the one. There's a fun scene with him and Sean Connery, and they're double entendre women's names. The main woman in this movie's name is Pussy Galore. Yeah, if you can believe that. And there's a lot of that sort of thing floating through the movies. The villain's lair, fun in the movies. Sometimes it's underwater. Sometimes it's in an extinct volcano. Who knows what. And the henchman, here we have Odd Job. I think in the movie he's Korean. And if you watch even just a chunk of Goldfinger, then all of the Austin Powers movies make so much more sense. They're pretty funny as they are. Mike Myers, pretty funny as they are. Clearly, he was a big fan of James Bond. Mostly, he's doing James Bond movies. Goldfinger, I think, becomes Fat Bastard in one of his Austin Powers movies. But if you watch a couple of the early James Bond movies, especially this one, then the Austin Powers movies are so much more fun. They really are. They're really a blast. Um, once you sort of see where the humor's coming from, that's for sure. So just the Bonds here again. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you, which one of these is not a Bond, or please list the Bonds in order, something like that. Don't worry about that. But the point that I kind of like to make about the Bonds is, and that's Sean Connery here. He was the very first one, and in my opinion, he's the best. Now, I know what I'm saying, right? I know that you mostly grew up on Daniel Craig, and the point I'm making is the star, the hero that we grow up with, is very often the one that we love the most. And for me, it was Sean Connery, and for you, you are going to be thinking about Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans and Chris Hemsworth and Chris Pine and Chris Pratt, all those guys. And when you're an old fart like me and they reboot Avengers for the second or third time, and we're on, what, our third Spider-Man by now, right? So you, in your lives, you've been through 3 Spider-Men, Spider-Mans, Spider-Teens, and a number of Batmans. You've been through a number of Batmen and a number of Supermen. And so they will reboot everything. This is called intellectual property, and they're very definitely going to have more Iron Men, and they're going to have more Thors and more Harry Potters, and it'll be weird. It'll be very weird. It's like, what? That's I like Robert Downey Jr. and what happened to, where's Chris Hemsworth? And I don't like this new whatever. And why does Spider-Man have to be female? And so on and so forth, right? They've been doing this stuff all in the comics, for sure, right? For Spider-Man, they have various people of color playing Spider-Man, and women doing Spider-Man, and so on and so forth. Okay, and it might seem kind of weird to a purist. Well, that's, I grew up with Tobey Maguire or something like that. And so I've lived through all these Bonds, and I've lived through all this other kind of stuff. And yeah, it's a little weird, and you kind of get used to it, really. And when there's another Captain America, and you'll, or Ms. America or whatever, you'll get used to it, I guess. And maybe you'll be, you'll complain just like an old timer like me. They don't make the Bonds as good as Sean Connery, and you'll say they don't make Iron Man, and they don't make Thors and Captain Americas and stuff like that. And it's going to happen because, movies are made for young people. And those movies are PG-13. Even the James Bond movies are PG-13. And, so from somewhere from 13 to 25 or so. And at some point, when you're 40 or 50, they won't be making movies for you anymore. And they'll find someone else. And it'll be kind of a weird feeling. I have to say, it's kind of a weird feeling when they're not really making movies for you anymore. But that's in the future. Although it seems to be happening. Like I said, they've Ben Affleck is done with Batman. There's another. They've already got another Batman lined up, and that will be out pretty soon. I don't know how many Supermans they've done and all that other kind of stuff. So we're kind of in the middle of that already. Okay. Anyway, that's it for me. Cine 104, class number 4. After you watch this, please go through the URLs, stay right there on YouTube, and click through. I've got the trailer for Rashomon and a nice analysis from Seven Samurai and some great scenes from 8½, Juliet of the Spirits and Seven Seal and Lawrence of Arabia and all that, and A Hard Day's Night, a bunch from A Hard Day's Night and Goldfinger. So go through those, have fun, go down the rabbit hole, see where they lead you. Watch the ones I provided for you, but maybe check some of the other ones out as well, and have a little bit of fun. Have a little bit of fun searching around and enjoying Um, the lecture is probably close to an hour. Class is normally 3 hours long, so I'd be showing lots of movie clips and all that, and of course we'd be taking breaks and all that. So don't be afraid to spend a little bit of time on this class and this presentation after you're done with this. Make sure you check out lots of the fun film clips.